Herodotus' account of Croesus' judgment concerning the prophetic value of the oracles seems to cast doubt on the divine authority of other famous oracular sanctuaries. Croesus ends up concluding from his test that Delphi and the oracle of Amphiaraus are the only true oracles. This could be, and has been, taken to imply that the rest, including Ammon, Abe, Dodona, Trophonius, and Branchidae, which is Didyma, are not. However, nowhere else in the histories are these oracles treated as false, and in fact, other pronouncements from these oracles are presented as being truly fulfilled. Nevertheless, some scholars have taken Croesus' test and judgment as evidence of a fierce competition between oracular sanctuaries over clientele. Others have thought that it is indicative of a general skepticism on Herodotus' part or his contemporary audience toward the value of oracles. Both of these interpretations, however, take for granted that Herodotus and his audience took Croesus' final judgment on the value of these oracles as accurate. In this paper, I argue that a comparison of Croesus' question, similar clauses from the extant oracular lamellae from Dodona, reveals an ambiguity that would have made room for two different kinds of true responses. Croesus' judgment about the truth of these oracles is, therefore, framed by his own intent. By this comparison, I show that Croesus' question may be understood either as a test, what do I happen to be doing right now, which is apparently what he intended, or as seeking advice, what might I do to have good fortune, which is what the consultants at Dodona seem to have meant when they used the same expression. While the oracles could have given either sound advice about having good fortune or a description of what Croesus happened to be doing at that moment, only the oracles that said something about making a stew would have seemed to Croesus to be true. In light of this fact, we may suppose that the other oracles were offering Croesus true advice about having good fortune that did not share any correspondence with cooking a tortoise and lamb stew. Thus, Croesus' judgment does not cast Herodotean or popular contemporary doubt on the prophetic value of oracles, but indicates once again Croesus' personal failure to understand the way oracular divination worked in Greece. When Croesus was considering waging war against the Persians, he wanted to get advice from the gods, but he wanted to make sure that it was the best advice. Thus, he conceived an elaborate scheme to test whether they might be found knowing the truth. He sent them away, commanding the Lydians as follows: after counting the days during the intervening time from that day on which they would leave Sardis, that they consult the oracles on the 100th day, asking what Croesus, son of Alyattes, king of the Lydians, happened to be doing. And after writing down whatever each of these oracles would prophesy, that they bring it back to him. Despite the number of oracles involved, the Pythia's response was the only oracular pronouncement that Herodotus knew. She said in verse, "But I know the number of sand and the measures of the sea, and I understand the mute, and I hear the one who does not speak. A scent comes to my senses of a hard-shelled tortoise, cooked in bronze with lamb flesh, below which is bronze, and bronze will be upon it." The delegates to Delphi wrote down the response and returned to Sardis. There, Herodotus lays the scene for a showdown of oracles in the presence of the king. And when the others who had been sent were also present, carrying their oracles, then Croesus, opening each one, was looking over the writings. Nothing of the others, in fact, was pleasing to him, but when he heard the one from Delphi, he made vows and accepted it, thinking that the only oracle was the one in Delphi, because it had discovered for him what things he did. Herodotus then explains why Croesus was overjoyed. His plan had been to do something on the 100th day that he supposed no one but a god could know. He had settled on cooking a stew of lamb and tortoise in a bronze pot. Thus, with the knowledge of what he had done, it seemed to him that the Pythia had smelled his boiling stew while he was cooking it on the 100th day from hundreds of miles away. Since Delphi was apparently the only oracle to describe correctly what Croesus was doing, he therefore thought that the only oracle was the one in Delphi. As the story makes clear, Delphi gave the answer that Croesus was expecting, and the others did not. Although Herodotus makes room for Amphiaraus at Thebes, given Croesus' apparent attachment to that oracle, the tale seems to some to emphasize the superiority of Delphi over the other oracular sanctuaries. Some scholars have pointed to the fact that the oracles that Croesus consulted appear to be a more fitting list of Delphi's 5th century oracular competition than of likely destinations for the Lydian king's delegates in the 6th century. They have concluded, therefore, that the story is a Delphic fiction designed to make the other oracular sanctuaries look like they delivered false oracles. Esther Eidenau, however, argues that such a notion of direct and intentional competition between oracular sanctuaries is entirely modern and bears implicit assumptions about what, how, and why there would have been competition that have difficulty finding evidentiary support. Especially important for my question here, she shows that numerous examples in which clients consult multiple oracles regarding the same issue are more indicative of cooperation than competition. Instead, she suggests that it is better to understand oracular sanctuaries as involved in occasionally overlapping networks of relationships he calls the market and futures. Since I'm inclined to believe that the story of Croesus' test was current at Delphi, it seems safer to think that Delphians perpetuated it as a way of showing the power of their oracle, not necessarily as a way of defaming the competition as though they could derive material benefit from condemning some of the best regarded oracular institutions in the world. A bolder group has supposed that the apparent failure of the other oracles falls in line with a contemporary critique against the validity of oracular divination. First, the debate over oracular fulfillment was certainly alive at the time of Herodotus, but there is no reason to suppose that skepticism was the rule rather than the exception. Herodotus himself was very much aware of the skeptics, and he seems to have been fine with calling out oracular frauds when he saw them. In particular, his story about the oracle's failure to convict the thief Amasis leaves little doubt that some oracles were thought of as being false, and that Herodotus himself was willing to call these Egyptian oracles liars, pseudeia. However, as our own Thomas Harrison has said, false prophets too, like false oracles, presuppose true ones. Herodotus clearly believed in the prophetic value of oracles. He showed the immoderate skeptics no quarter in debate on the issue of oracular fulfillment, where he thought the evidence was convincing, as his attention to the oracles of Bacchus shows. More than that, oracular fulfillment is the principle underlying the structure of many of his narratives, and the fact that these narratives seem to have pre-existed him in an oral tradition suggests that the belief in oracular fulfillment was widespread, both in the past and in his own time. Moreover, to understand from this passage that the other oracles were false is to take Croesus' judgment on the matter for granted. That Delphi was the only true oracle is in fact Croesus' judgment and not that of the narrator. The Lydian king, though, is a famously unreliable source when it comes to determining oracular meaning. As the narrator and through the voice of the Pythia, Herodotus makes painfully clear where and how Croesus went wrong in dealing with oracles. Therefore, we should not automatically take Croesus' judgment as being reasonable or even true. There is more reason to think that Herodotus did not intend to leave his audience thinking that Croesus' judgment was correct. A number of the sanctuaries to which Croesus sent his delegates reappear elsewhere in the histories. Apollo at Abai, Trophonius at Labadeia, and the oracle of Amphiaraus at Thebes were among those that Mardonius consulted through his delegate Mus. Although Herodotus did not know what they told him, he guessed that they, quote, predicted pro legoi, that if Mardonius had gained the Athenians as allies, he would have been victorious. This conditional oracular claim, of course, is never falsified in advance, and the prediction could have been true if this condition had been met. Additionally, a number of these oracles were taken as authoritative and were obeyed. The oracle of Amphiaraus told the Thebans that they must choose between receiving his gifts as a mantis or as an ally, and they decided to have him as an ally rather than consult his oracle. The Pelasgians invoked their gods by the names that Zeus at Dodona had approved. The same oracle, along with Delphi, told the Apollonians of their crime against Eugenius. And the same oracle, along with Delphi, also told the Apollonians of their crime, uh, also told against the crime against Eugenius and explained what to do in recompense and accurately predicted the gift of foresight that Eugenius later received. Zeus Ammon at Siwa Oasis defined Egypt and Egyptians in such a way that the people of Maria and Apis were compelled to continue abstaining from the meat of cows despite their own desires. The Cumaeans consulted Branchidite regarding the asylum of the Persian Pactus, and although they did not like its responses very much, it happened that Pactus was in fact handed over to the Persians eventually, and Cumae was subjugated, just as the oracle predicted. Nowhere else, in my opinion, is there even a hint that these oracles were unreliable or unauthoritative, and by all appearances, they actually gave oracular pronouncements that were true, could have been true if their conditions were fulfilled, or were followed in their prescriptions. As matters stand, we are left with a difficult choice to make. The apparent failure of these oracles to have seen what Croesus was doing on the 100th day certainly does make it look as though their powers of foresight were not as strong as Delphi's. However, there is little reason to think that these institutions were actually competing in the modern sense of the term, or to suppose that the Delphians would have been so bold as to call these very prominent oracles liars. This story might have been entertaining in an intellectual environment in which the truth of oracles was viewed with some skepticism. However, Herodotus and most of his contemporaries were apparently sympathetic to oracular fulfillment, and the notion that these oracles failed to grasp the truth ultimately assumes the validity of Croesus' judgment, despite the manifest issue of his weak record of dealing with oracles effectively. Additionally, one could object, perhaps, that some oracles were thought of as authoritative and prophetic only every now and then, in light of the passages above. But this explanation raises an issue of variation in the underwriting source of oracular divination that only appears much later in Greek thought as a way of explaining the total obsolescence of certain sanctuaries. For Herodotus, it seems that the validity of oracular divination is an all-or-nothing game. The source of real and authoritative oracular institutions and collections abides even when malicious agents interfere with their communications. But where it is not present, like in Amasis' Egyptian oracles, there can only be pure frauds. For these reasons, we should seek an explanation that can harmonize the apparent inconsistencies in the text. As Julia Kint observes, Croesus' test differs from the typical oracular consultation in instructive ways. She says, quote, Herodotus' depiction of the oracle test is a grotesque distortion of an ordinary request at Delphi. To test the oracles, Croesus turns the modern procedure of an oracular consultation upside down. This holds true in two respects. First, in this case, the protagonist already knows the right answer to the question that he asks the oracles. Second, it is not the protagonist who is challenged by an obscure divine answer, but the oracular institutions that are challenged by the protagonist's obscure doings. Essentially, her argument here is aimed at establishing a kind of role reversal in this tale. Her first point about Croesus' knowledge of the answer to his own question is important. There are other stories in which people used the knowledge they possessed to test oracles, but oracular divination, of course, did not exist to be tested. Generally speaking, people in the ancient world used divination to acquire knowledge about the past, present, and future that they did not already have. Regarding her second observation about role reversal, Kint notes that Herodotus' story substitutes typical oracular obscurity for the obscurity of Croesus' actions. But this second role reversal is more apparent than real. Within the context of the test, it may appear to Croesus that he presented the oracles with obscurity and received clear responses. However, I argue that an ambiguity in his phrasing of the question resulted in oracular ambiguity of a sort that is comparable to the familiar Great Empire and Mule King problems. In all these stories, Croesus interprets the oracles in the context of his own intent. He intends to topple the expanding Persian Empire, and so he determines that great empire must be the Persian one. He intends to rule for a long time, and so he thinks that a mule king of Persia is impossible. He intends to test whether the oracles can see him cooking, and so he believes that some of the oracles could not or did not. The kind of test that of prophetic power that Croesus intends would have been improper in the context of oracular consultation, as Kent has pointed out. Given that fact, we should wonder whether the divinatory context could have affected how his question could be understood. Croesus' delegates are told to ask the oracles, hoti poieton tun kanoi, ho ludon basileus Croesus ho aloateo. The construction tun kanen with a supplementary participle is a familiar expression in which the verb, as Smythe puts it, loses the idea of chance and denotes mere coincidence in time. Thus, what Croesus and his delegates mean by this question is, what does Croesus, son of Alyattes, king of the Lydians, happen to be doing? But how would Croesus' question have been understood in the divinatory context? Thanks to the publication of a great number of tablets from Dodona in 2013, we now have a significant body of evidence by which to understand why people consulted that oracle and how they phrased their inquiries. There are over 4,000 inscriptions relating to public and private inquiries spanning the 6th and the 2nd centuries BCE. Close analysis of these tablets reveals certain patterns of expression that are typical in an oracular context, and much of this analytical work still remains to be done. Here, I limit my inquiry to the words and syntax of Croesus' question, hoti poieton tun kanoi, and I'm happy to speak more about the choice of mood in the subordinate clause during the Q&A. By studying how this clause and similar ones are used in the corpus of inscriptions, I show that Croesus' question has a completely different meaning in the oracular context. Among the extant complete inscriptions, there are a few inquiries that parallel Croesus' phrasing nearly exactly. In these cases, the contexts demand an unexpected interpretation of the expression. In the first 2 tablets, the consultants were clearly asking for advice about all his or her possessions on the one hand, and about the things he or she lost on the other. They were apparently not testing the oracle. In the third, the consultant used the form eutukein to emphasize his interest in prospering or having good fortune. Thus, tipoion appears to express a question about the specific action that will lead to tunkanen, which must be understood in its primary sense of achieving a state of fortune or success. In the oracular context, therefore, the phrasing of Croesus' question means, doing what might he be fortunate? There is a long list of other fragmentary inscriptions in which the same or similar clause might tentatively be restored, accepting the substitution of different participles of making or doing, like poiein, prosein, or drawn. The expression, therefore, might have been more common than our 3 intact inscriptions would indicate. Moreover, there are a number of clauses that are quite comparable in different ways. So, for example, accomplishing or doing what? Will it be better and more good for him? And will there be a beneficial acquisition of money? Or doing what might they have health and offspring and male issue? A particularly unfortunate one for the masculine offspring that the man has previously had. Doing what might he have more masculine offspring in the sense that he's not masculine enough? And finally, having done what might I be in good health? Some percentage of these inscriptions for which I have suggested tikat poion tunkanoi above might instead have utilized different terms, like those I have just listed, and a number of other fragmentary inscriptions may fall into this group as well. However, there is a basic similarity of form common to all. These are all questions about what action to undertake, tipoion, for achieving some kind of desirable state, to speak generally, tunkanen. The evidence not only shows the prevalence of the phrase doing what, it also makes clear that it was relatively common for consultants to ask Zeus more open-ended questions. Scholarship has rightly emphasized the predominance of two basic question forms. Should I do X action? And to whom of the gods should I sacrifice in order to be successful in X? However, the expanded data from Dodona now shows a wider variety and a greater number of open-ended questions, like where and how. The most common open-ended question, as we have seen, is what? While consultants often seem to have phrased their inquiries by using the words typoion or something similar, along with a finite verb reflecting a desirable state, at other times they simply used the construction t with a finite form of poiein, prosein, or dron, as these examples show. The consultant who wrote 3445a frames his question with the explicit mention of good fortune in the editor's judgment, and others seem to imply as much. Fortune is regularly an explicit concern in the tablets, as we can see from the numerous appearances of Eutychia, Panteuchia, Tuca, and Tuchaios. And even if that were not the case, I think it is safe to assume that no one would have gone to the oracle in order to fare badly, or even averagely in what they ended up doing. The interrogative t with a finite form of poiein, prosein, or dron, therefore, effectively means the same thing as ti ka poion tunkano. Finally, consultants frequently employed the verb tunkanein in their inquiries. But with a participle, it almost never means what Croesus did. Rather, as we have seen with the examples of the form ti ka poion tunkanoi, the participle almost always represents the circumstance under which good fortune, either eutukain or tukanein, is expected. For example, one client wrote about a wife, whether he might be fortunate taking Claulis as a wife. There are quite a number of actions and states that consultants were considering: picking up, dedicating, applying oneself, traveling abroad, farming, being judged, giving, being happy, trading, returning, pruning, praying, emigrating, holding, being, living, sacrificing, being healed, propitiating, burying, carrying, dwelling, sharing, acquiring, sailing, doing, owning a ship, completing, being a widow, and even using. In fact, there are only 2 inscriptions where consultants clearly used tunkanein with a participle in a way consonant with Croesus usage. In the first tablet, the consultant asks whether, not what, and about acting in what way is best. Thus, a tunkanoi ka poieon must not refer to any future plan, but to something the consultant was presently doing. Otherwise, it would have to mean something like whether he might be fortunate acting in what way is best, which is a question that would not need to be asked. The consultant who wrote the second tablet was more concerned about the cause of her present illness than with what to do about it in the future. What becomes clear is that our ability to understand the intent of these questions is greatly dependent on context. When referring to the past or present, consultants use tunkanein with a participle, rarely, to ask about whether matters happened to be a certain way. When referring to the future, they use tunkanein with a participle more commonly to ask about what they should do to be successful and whether they would be successful in what they proposed. The phrasing of Croesus' question to the oracles is, therefore, quite ambiguous. In the way Herodotus presents the question, there is not enough context about the crisis that promoted oracular consultation, and no indication about Croesus' particular interest in the present that would help an oracle determine whether he was referring to a present reality or a future circumstance. It is only because Herodotus provides the background of the king's plan to test the oracles of Greece that the audience even knows for certain what Croesus really means. However, it seems very unlikely that oracular sanctuaries anticipated inquiries designed to test their prophetic powers. It is related to this fact that although tuncaning with a participle like poieon may mean happen to be doing, this meaning is extremely rare in an oracular context. Further, the expression tika poion tunkane among the Dodona tablets almost always means doing what will he or she be fortunate. Thus, in an oracular context, Croesus' question could have been taken in a way that he did not intend. Oops. Accepting the possibility that the oracular sanctuaries apart from Delphi may have understood Croesus' meaning differently has important consequences for how we read this story. First of all, the other oracles that Croesus received may not be wrong, strictly speaking. If the question he asked may mean, what does Croesus happen to be doing? Or doing what will he be fortunate? In theory, all of the responses would have come back with a description of a particular action or actions. However, Croesus was looking for the oracle that corresponded to his stew test, not for oracles that would tell him how to be fortunate in life, though perhaps he should have. Thus, his judgment was framed by his intent. This means that the other oracles may have offered good and eventually advice, but Croesus ignored them because they were false in the context of the test that he had arranged. Of course, the primacy of Delphi's prophetic insight may still be a factor in the tale that Herodotus tells. However, in this reading, the fact that the Pythia was the only prophet who smelled and described what Croesus happened to be doing does not mean that the other oracles lacked prophetic insight altogether. I contend that this interpretation is more consonant with Herodotus' attitudes towards these oracles in the broader context of the Histories. The interpretation that I propose here also gives greater significance to the second line of the Delphic oracle. As the Pythia says, "But I know the number of sand and the measures of the sea, and I understand the mute, and I hear the one who does not speak." These lines, of course, do not seem germane to Croesus' question, and so scholars have typically explained them as a stock manifesto of Apollo's prophetic powers, to quote H.W. Park and D.E.W. Wormel. Kint extends the importance of this declaration of divine omniscience further by suggesting that it is meant as a, quote, hint to Croesus that Apollo can see more than he, and that things can turn out to be different than they appear at first sight, unquote. These observations are likely to be true, but I think there is more. In the context of Croesus' ambiguous inquiry, the Pythia's claim to understand the mute and to hear the one who does not speak may be read as emphasizing the fact that she understood what Croesus actually meant by his question, even though it meant something completely different in an oracular context. This interpretation might be taken to suggest that the oracles apart from Delphi simply misunderstood Croesus' question and the nature of his test. However, there is something odd about the idea that the gods and heroes of the other oracular sanctuaries could have had authoritative knowledge about the past, present, and future, and yet misunderstand what Croesus meant. It was a relatively common notion that oracles could read the minds of their consultants. A particularly famous example is Xenophon's consultation at Delphi before launching on his campaign. Quote, "And going, Xenophon asked Apollo, sacrificing and praying to whom of the gods he might complete most fairly and best the journey which he has in mind, and having completed it, he might be safe." Interestingly, Socrates criticized Xenophon for asking the wrong question about to whom of the gods he should pray, and not whether he ought to go at all. But he says nothing about assuming that Apollo could read his mind about his intent to go and fight in the east. Some of the lead tablets from Dodona show similar phrases that seem to assume that Zeus knew the thoughts of his consultants. And I didn't have time to look through the whole catalog. It was sort of a last minute thought. So I'll have to follow up on that. There could be far more examples of this. It may seem strange that these consultants would not reveal verbally the exact nature of their inquiry. However, such and even far more extensive attempts at concealment, like the Athenian consultation about the sacred Orgos in 352 BCE, seems to have been done more to conceal the matter from meddling humans, who were sometimes accused of interfering with the gods' messages, than from the gods themselves. After all, in order to take away an authoritative sanction, these consultants must assume that Zeus knew of whom and about what they were concerned. The evidence above may even enrich the interpretation that I have been developing still further. If we assume that the oracle of Amphiaraus, Ammon, Abai, Dodona, Trophonius, and Branchidae all recognized Croesus' intent, as some consultants at oracular sanctuaries clearly believed, and they gave responses about what the king should do to have good fortune, as I have suggested, then the result is a more profound dramatic irony. Viewed in the context of the greater narrative arc of the Croesus Logos, the king's rise and fall, punctuated by the interview with Solon with its emphasis on happiness and good fortune, and capped with Croesus' own reflection about that conversation on the pyre, it seems appropriate that these oracles would have answered the question that he should have met by the words he used. Croesus' blindness about the mutability of human fortune, since neither Solon nor the oracles could get him to look to the end. There is good reason to think that Herodotus' 5th century audience would have been rather familiar with the habits of communication in an oracular context, and would, therefore, have been in a position to draw these connections. First, most of the tablets from Dodona bear inquiries of private consultants rather than communities, and there are obvious patterns of expression used for framing the purpose and substance of consultations. These facts suggest a broad familiarity with the grammar of communication in the oracular context, at least among those who took their problems to Dodona. Second, Herodotus sometimes counts on his audience's knowledge of divination at the most famous oracles in Greece when drawing analogies with the practice at less familiar ones. The rite of divination in Egyptian Thebes and in Dodona, as he says, happen to be similar to each other. And the prophetess of Satrian Dionysus declares oracles just like in Delphi, and there is nothing more complicated. If we may suppose that Herodotus' audience knew about the kinds of questions that people tended to ask of oracles on account of these reasons, we should also think that some may have gasped, sighed, or shaken their heads when they heard how Croesus intended to phrase his test question, and again later when they heard about Croesus' displeasure with the oracles he received. The rest of the Logos further corroborates this impression, if there were any doubt before, that Croesus was obviously not familiar with how oracular divination was undertaken. Given the king's numerous failures at interpreting oracular truth, it is unlikely that Herodotus' audience would have taken his judgment of the oracles here as representing the facts of the matter. Nor should we, for our part, think that his judgment represents Herodotus' own views or these oracles, or contemporary skepticism toward the effectiveness of oracular divination. Croesus' judgment is his own, tendentious, uncritical, and deeply flawed. Thank you.